There is a reason humanity treats fresh water as if it will never run out. It flows from taps on demand, fills reservoirs after the rain, and has cycled through the planet for billions of years. Water feels ancient, eternal, and self-renewing. But this perception is not just wrong, it is dangerously misleading. From space, Earth looks like a blue planet overflowing with water. That image has shaped our collective psychology. Oceans dominate the surface, clouds circle the globe, rivers carve continents. The visual abundance creates a powerful illusion that water is limitless, and therefore cannot become scarce in any meaningful way. Yet this assumption collapses the moment we look at the numbers. Approximately 97% of all water on Earth is saltwater, unusable for human consumption, agriculture, or most industrial processes without expensive and energy-intensive desalination. Of the remaining 3% that is technically fresh, nearly 70% is locked away in glaciers and ice caps. Most of the rest exists as deep groundwater, inaccessible or non-renewable on human timescales. What remains, the water in rivers, lakes, shallow aquifers, and soil, represents less than 1% of the planet's total water supply. This tiny fraction is all modern civilization runs on. Every city, every farm, every power plant, and every industrial supply chain depends on this narrow band of accessible fresh water. Yet we behave as if it replenishes instantly. We pump aquifers faster than they recharge. We divert rivers beyond recovery. We consume water as though hydrological systems respond on quarterly earnings timelines rather than geological ones. The idea that fresh water is renewable comes from a misunderstanding of scale. Yes, water cycles through evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. But the rate at which usable fresh water is naturally restored is far slower than the rate at which modern societies extract and consume it. When an aquifer that took thousands of years to fill is drained in decades, renewal becomes a myth. When a river no longer reaches the sea, the cycle is broken. What makes this illusion especially dangerous is that water scarcity rarely announces itself dramatically at first. Unlike oil, which spikes in price when supply tightens, water shortages emerge quietly. Wells produce less. Reservoirs drop a few percentage points each year. Crops require more irrigation for the same yields. These changes feel manageable, until they are not. Civilizations in the past collapsed under far smaller hydrological stresses. The difference today is scale. Billions of people, globalized food systems, and tightly coupled infrastructure mean that localized water stress no longer stays local. A depleted river basin can destabilize regions thousands of miles away through food prices, migration, and political unrest. The illusion of infinite water persists because scarcity has been postponed, not avoided. Modern engineering, dams, pumps, and groundwater extraction have delayed the consequences, creating the false impression of control. But physics does not negotiate. Hydrology does not respond to belief. The planet is not running out of water, it is running out of accessible, reliable fresh water at the exact moment civilization depends on it most. And the more we treat this resource as infinite, the faster it moves toward becoming the scarcest asset of the 21st century. Unlike oil shocks, water crises do not arrive with headlines, embargoes, or sudden price spikes. They unfold quietly, year after year, disguised as drought cycles, infrastructure strain, or temporary shortages. This is what makes water scarcity more dangerous than any energy crisis before it. It advances slowly enough to be ignored, until it becomes irreversible. Climate change is the first accelerator of this silent deficit. Rising global temperatures do not simply reduce rainfall, they destabilize the entire hydrological system. Wet regions become wetter in short, destructive bursts, while dry regions become persistently drier. Snowpacks melt earlier, glaciers retreat, and seasonal water storage disappears. Rivers that once provided predictable flows now swing between floods and droughts, making long-term planning nearly impossible. Water still falls from the sky, but not where, when, or how societies need it. Population growth compounds this instability. Every additional person requires water not just to drink, but to eat, work, and exist within a modern economy. Urbanization intensifies the problem by concentrating demand in places often far from natural water sources. Megacities grow faster than their reservoirs, aquifers, and infrastructure can support. Unlike oil, which can be shipped across oceans, water is heavy, local, and expensive to move. Demand rises everywhere, but supply remains geographically fixed. Agriculture is where the deficit becomes structural. Roughly 70% of all freshwater withdrawals globally are used for farming. This is not inefficient farming, it is the physical reality of food production. Crops are water converted into calories. As populations grow and diets shift toward meat, dairy, and processed foods, water demand increases exponentially. Producing 1 kilogram of beef can require over 15,000 liters of water when feed, land, and processing are included. There is no technological shortcut that eliminates this requirement. The critical problem is that water scarcity develops slower than oil shortages, but cuts deeper. Oil scarcity raises prices and incentivizes alternatives. Water scarcity undermines food systems, public health, energy production, and political stability simultaneously. You can substitute fuels. You cannot substitute water. When oil becomes expensive, economies adjust. When water disappears, societies fracture. What makes this crisis particularly insidious is that it hides behind averages. Global water availability appears sufficient on paper. The crisis is regional, uneven, and cumulative. Aquifers are depleted silently. Rivers are overallocated legally before they are exhausted physically. By the time shortages become visible, the buffer is already gone. Water does not need to fully run out to destabilize a civilization. It only needs to become unreliable. Once farmers cannot predict irrigation, cities cannot guarantee supply, and governments cannot arbitrate competing demands, stress turns into conflict. Not ideological conflict, survival conflict. The silent deficit is already here. It does not explode like an oil shock. It tightens like a vice. And by the time the pressure is felt everywhere, there is no strategic reserve left to release. Water is not just a natural resource. It is the invisible operating system of civilization. Whoever controls water controls food production. Whoever controls food controls population stability. And whoever controls population stability controls power. This chain is not theoretical, it is the foundational logic of every durable empire in history. Modern societies often treat food shortages as agricultural or economic problems. In reality, they are water problems in disguise. Crops do not fail because of markets or politics. They fail because water is unavailable, mistimed, or redirected. Irrigation systems, river flows, aquifers, and rainfall patterns determine whether regions export food, import food, or collapse under scarcity. Control the water upstream, and you dictate outcomes downstream without firing a single shot. This is why water governance is inherently political. When a state regulates reservoirs, dams, and irrigation rights, it is deciding which regions prosper and which slowly decline. A guaranteed water supply stabilizes rural economies, locks populations in place, and suppresses migration pressures. Cut or restrict that supply, and food prices rise, farmers abandon land, and people move. Migration is not caused by ideology or culture. It is driven by resource failure. Water scarcity is the trigger, migration is the consequence. Food prices amplify this power dynamic. Water scarcity raises production costs, reduces yields, and introduces volatility into supply chains. Even small disruptions ripple outward, increasing prices far beyond the affected region. Urban populations feel this immediately. When food prices rise faster than wages, political legitimacy erodes. History shows a consistent pattern. Spikes in food prices precede unrest, protests, and regime instability. Water does not appear in the headlines, food does, but water is the lever being pulled behind the scenes. Energy and industry are bound to this equation as well. Power plants require vast quantities of water for cooling. Biofuels compete directly with food crops for water and land. Manufacturing depends on stable water access to operate at scale. When water is constrained, governments must decide which sectors survive. These are not technical decisions, they are exercises of authority. This is why water functions as a form of silent leverage. Unlike oil embargoes or trade sanctions, water control often operates within legal frameworks and infrastructure projects. Dams are presented as development. Diversions are justified as efficiency. Yet the downstream effects can reshape entire regions. One country's hydroelectric project becomes another country's agricultural collapse. The most destabilizing aspect of water power is its invisibility. People do not revolt when a dam is built. They revolt years later when harvests fail and prices soar. By then, the control structure is already in place. The authority has shifted. Water does not announce itself as power. It disguises itself as management, optimization, and sustainability. But beneath those words lies a simple truth: control the water, and you control who eats, who moves, who pays more, and who governs tomorrow. Future conflicts will not begin with invasions or declarations. They will begin upstream. The most dangerous borders of the 21st century are not lines drawn on maps, but rivers that cross them. Water ignores sovereignty, but power does not. And where rivers, populations, and politics intersect, pressure accumulates. The Middle East sits at the center of this reality. It is one of the most water-stressed regions on Earth, yet it depends on river systems shared by multiple rival states. The Tigris and Euphrates originate in Turkey, flow through Syria, and sustain Iraq. Every dam built upstream shifts power downstream. Control of flow becomes control of agriculture, electricity, and survival. These are not hypothetical risks. Water infrastructure has already been used as leverage and as a weapon in regional conflicts. Central Asia presents a quieter but equally volatile case. Rivers fed by melting glaciers in the Tian Shan and Pamir Mountains supply countries with competing needs. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan control headwaters. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan depend on downstream flows for agriculture. As glaciers retreat and seasonal runoff becomes unpredictable, cooperation erodes. What once worked under Soviet central planning now fragments under national interests, creating a zero-sum dynamic where no country can afford to yield control. India and Pakistan share one of the most dangerous water relationships on the planet. The Indus River system sustains hundreds of millions of people and underpins Pakistan's agricultural economy. India controls key upstream infrastructure. Both nations possess nuclear weapons. Water treaties have held for decades, but climate stress, population growth, and infrastructure expansion are testing their limits. When water becomes scarce, treaties become fragile. Africa's water conflicts are already emerging. The Nile Basin involves 11 countries, but real power concentrates around Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam. For Ethiopia, it represents development and sovereignty. For Egypt, it represents existential risk. Similar dynamics play out across the Sahel, where desertification, groundwater depletion, and population growth fuel local conflicts that escalate into regional instability. Even the United States is not exempt. The American Southwest is approaching hard physical limits. The Colorado River no longer reliably reaches the sea. States, cities, agriculture, and energy producers compete over allocations based on assumptions that no longer reflect reality. Legal agreements written during unusually wet decades now collide with prolonged drought. When water contracts exceed water availability, law alone cannot resolve the conflict. Rivers are dangerous borders because they turn geography into leverage. You cannot relocate a river. You cannot rapidly replace its flow. Infrastructure built today locks in power relationships for generations. Unlike oil fields, rivers cannot be diversified away from. When control shifts upstream, downstream vulnerability becomes permanent. These conflicts will rarely look like traditional wars. They will unfold through dams, diversions, treaties, and temporary restrictions that never reverse. By the time tensions become visible, dependence is already established. The geography of future wars is not defined by armies or alliances. It is defined by watersheds. And as scarcity intensifies, the map of global power will be redrawn, not by borders, but by flow. Water was once treated as a commons, a shared foundation of human survival that existed outside markets and ownership. That assumption is quietly disappearing. Across the world, water is being transformed from a public necessity into a controlled asset, governed by contracts, infrastructure, and capital. This shift is not ideological. It is structural. Corporations are not buying water itself. They are buying what matters more: access, control, and priority. Wells, aquifers, reservoirs, treatment plants, pipelines, desalination facilities, and distribution networks are increasingly owned or operated by private entities. Water rights are consolidated through legal systems that favor capital over communities. Once those rights are secured, control becomes long-term and enforceable, regardless of public sentiment. Governments play a central role in this transformation. Facing aging infrastructure and fiscal constraints, states outsource water management to private operators under public-private partnerships. These arrangements promise efficiency and investment, but they also lock in pricing models and access rules that prioritize financial stability over universal availability. Water becomes something delivered to customers, not guaranteed to citizens. Financial institutions and investment funds have entered the water sector with growing intensity. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and private equity firms now view water infrastructure as a low-volatility, high-dependence asset. Demand is non-negotiable. People cannot opt out of consumption. In an era of instability, water offers predictable returns precisely because scarcity increases its value. This financialization changes behavior. When water is treated as an asset, conservation competes with profitability. Infrastructure expansion targets regions where users can pay, not where need is greatest. Rural communities, small farmers, and marginalized populations lose bargaining power against entities that control flow through legal ownership rather than force. Perhaps the most dangerous shift is psychological. Privatization reframes water not as a right, but as a service. Once this framing is accepted, access becomes conditional. Miss a payment, lose supply. Challenge a contract, face litigation. The resource that sustains life becomes mediated by terms and enforcement mechanisms designed for markets, not survival. States also weaponize this logic. By controlling licensing, extraction permits, and infrastructure investment, governments decide who gains access and who is excluded. Strategic industries receive guarantees. Households receive restrictions. In times of scarcity, allocation reflects power, not equity. This transformation rarely sparks immediate resistance because it happens incrementally. A treatment plant here, a concession there, a regulatory adjustment framed as modernization. By the time consequences emerge, the system is legally and financially entrenched. Water is becoming a strategic asset not because of greed, but because of necessity under scarcity. Control is shifting to those who can finance infrastructure and navigate legal systems. What was once shared by default is now owned by design. The privatization of water is not the loss of a resource. It is the redefinition of life itself as something managed, priced, and allocated. And once that transition is complete, reversing it becomes almost impossible. The next global conflicts over water will not be announced as wars. There will be no formal declarations. No armies crossing borders. No single moment the world can point to and say, this is where it began. Because water wars do not need bullets to work. They operate through infrastructure, contracts, and control. A dam built upstream can reduce a river's flow without firing a shot. A reservoir can be, temporarily, filled while downstream regions face permanent shortages. Water allocations can be adjusted, delayed, or suspended, all under the language of engineering, efficiency, or environmental protection. And yet the effect is the same as a blockade. Fields dry out. Food production collapses. Prices rise. People move. What makes water conflict uniquely dangerous is that it can be framed as nonviolent while producing systemic damage on a massive scale. Unlike oil, water cannot be stockpiled easily. Unlike gas, it cannot be rerouted across continents overnight. It must flow, and whoever controls the flow controls everything downstream. Modern water conflicts will look like sanctions rather than invasions. Trade restrictions tied to environmental compliance. Infrastructure projects presented as domestic development. Legal disputes over river rights that quietly redefine who gets to survive and who does not. We are already watching this model take shape. Rivers that cross borders are being weaponized through dams, diversions, and legal frameworks that favor upstream nations. Downstream countries are left with shrinking supplies but no clear act of aggression to respond to. Retaliation becomes diplomatically impossible, even as livelihoods collapse. This is why water conflicts are so difficult to stop. There is no obvious enemy. No single trigger event. No clear violation of international law. Water control can always be justified as internal policy. Climate change accelerates this instability. Rainfall becomes unpredictable. Glaciers shrink. Aquifers are depleted faster than they can recharge. As scarcity increases, cooperation becomes politically expensive and control becomes strategically irresistible. Once water infrastructure is built, it cannot be uninvented. Once rivers are regulated, they do not return to their natural state. Once populations depend on artificial flow systems, any disruption becomes catastrophic. This locks regions into permanent vulnerability. Unlike ideological conflicts, water disputes do not end with treaties. They persist as long as rivers flow unevenly and populations continue to grow. The most dangerous part is not that water will cause conflict. It is that these conflicts will unfold slowly, quietly, and legally, until their consequences are irreversible. By the time shortages become visible, the mechanisms of control are already in place. By the time populations react, dependence has already been established. By the time the world recognizes the crisis, there may be no peaceful way to unwind it. The wars of the future will not be fought over territory or ideology. They will be fought over access. And in a world where civilization stops without water, control of that access becomes the ultimate form of power.